Hello, welcome back to our fifth and final Grisaille drawing workshop. Thank you for coming by again today. Right, we'll make a start. Today we're going to look at ways to translate the drawing techniques that we've done over the previous weeks into painting. So, Grisaille, as discussed, is painting only using black and white, possibly beige, brown and white, but generally black and white. So the first thing we need to do is to discuss what, I know this sort of sounds a bit odd, but what colour black to use. So here I've got carbon black. These are all acrylic paints, by the way, I should have said. So I've got carbon black, and this is carbon black mixed with white. So there we are. And then I've got Mars black, and this is Mars black mixed with white. Just give that a bit of a stir so you can see it better. And this mixture has got a little bit more white in it. However, the main difference, I hope you can see that the carbon black is a sort of bluer black, and the Mars black is a redder black. So when you're choosing the black and white you want to paint with, you need to experiment with the black paint that you have, mix it with white, and then work out, if you have a choice, do you want it to be a bluer black, so something like carbon black, or do you want it to be warmer, redder black, in which case Mars black. You'll notice a lot of colours are called Mars, so Mars yellow, Mars red, and it just means that they're earth colours. So they're colours that have been dug up from the ground, mostly iron oxides. That's why they're called Mars. So you pick your black, and then you can mix it with white. These, now if I put my hand here, I'm hoping this will come back into focus. There we go. These flowers here, I've stuck with the same flower all the way along, my tree peony. These have been painted on a grey background. So here's a bit of white card for comparison. So you can see I've actually painted these with a mixture of Mars black and a tiny bit of white. I wanted to use this slightly warmer grey. Now the advantage of painting the background, when we were doing our drawing, our white background was our brightest colour and our brightest highlight. So if you're painting on a grey background, you can then use white as a highlight, or you'll want to use white as a highlight. But it also gives the option to make something very sort of subtle so that the grey disappears into the grey background. So this one here, there are no white highlights, and this one I've added some white highlights. So here, rather than mixing up grey paint, I've just done this whole thing as if it were a watercolour. So I'm just going to get a little bit of paint on my brush. And I painted the whole thing with little lines. Again, let's get that to come back into focus. So I traced it on using the tracing. And then I've done all of my painting with little lines side by side to create the shapes. Now, I haven't blended them other than by just touching them with my finger to lose the edges of the lines, to sort of blur them in together a bit. And where I've wanted the line to be darker, so I've just used water mixed with Mars black, and where I want a darker area, I've added a bit more paint to the water. Now that's because I wanted the paint to be really see-through. I quite like this effect. I don't know whether you've noticed the brush that I'm using. It's got long bristles. this brush next to it, that's a normal sort of paintbrush. I think it would be described as a sort of pencil brush if it had a name for the shape. This one with the longer bristles is called a rigger, and it's quite a useful brush if you come across one for painting long, fine lines and very fine lines in general. So when I'm painting trees and flowers and I want to paint a really long line, it's almost like having a very fine ink pen. It carries quite a lot of paint, and you can get a lot of detail and add quite a lot of, do quite a lot of work on your painting before you need to add more paint to the brush. But a little pencil brush would be absolutely fine for doing the same, exactly the same job. But for all of this detail, the one thing you have to remember if you're painting these fine lines is that the paint needs to be really watery. So you need to get the paint to be almost like water. Do you see it's really, really thin? And then wipe most of it off the end of the brush. If you have a lot of paint on the brush, when you put it down on the surface, you'll just get a blob. You won't get a neat line. So nice lot of watery paint, sort of almost like ink consistency, and then wipe most of it off the end of the brush, and then do your painting. And because the paint is so thin, it's going to dry really fast, so you can work away quite happily, going back over things. Just one note of caution: if you make the paint really thin and you want to, say you're doing this painting on a wall and you want to wipe the wall down with a sponge, say you're doing this painting in a kitchen, you think I want to clean the wall, if you don't have, if the paint is really watery, it might come off when you wipe the surface. Paint is made of pigment and a glue. The glue is called a binder. And if you don't have enough binder in the mixture, the paint won't stick properly anymore. So really watery paint is absolutely fine if you're working on a canvas or on a piece of card. But on the wall, you might want to varnish it afterwards, or that would be another option. So over here, I've added highlights. Adding highlights with very thin paint really won't work on this pale grey. So I put actual quite big blobs of paint on. And if you add highlights with very thick paint, there was an artist called Turner, I don't know if you've seen any of his work, he did highlights with very thick blobs of paint. And do you see the blobs cast a shadow beside them? So it makes the white paint look really bright because it's sitting next to its own little shadow. So here I'm painting on cards, on thin artist's mount boards. But if you're not working on the wall, you could paint some packaging cards or some thick paper. Our thin paper isn't going to be so good because if we add watery paint, it's going to cockle. So you want to paint onto some card if you have some. I've put a light grey background. You might want to paint a white background, a black background, or you might want to do a coloured background. So on this charcoal drawing, I've added a colour, and you might want to do that as well. So if you're going back and doing more drawing with pencil or with charcoal, you might want to try out working on a coloured background as well. Now, getting a little bit closer again to our drawing techniques, I just wanted to talk about using masks and stencils. So when we were doing our drawing, we had some torn paper to create edges, and we had some cut out shapes. And what you can do with paint, you can do exactly the same thing, and you can get some quite nice blending techniques if you use cut a shape out of paper or out of corrugated card, packaging card. This is just some thin card or heavy paper that I've used here. So there's a slightly different technique for applying the paint and a different brush. So I've got a brush with the end is quite, can't really show that to the end is quite flat. This one has a little bit of a dome, but it's quite flat on the end. And for this technique, you need to use really thick paint. So I'm going to just mix up, I've got a bit of black and white there. So I'll mix those together. If we were doing our painting, you know, you're painting your flowers or whatever your design is, I'm mixing the paint up here on the palette and using it as I go along. I think if you're doing a large scale piece of work, it would be really good to mix up, say, a dark grey, a medium grey and a light grey, put them in some jam jars or, you know, anything with a lid on, some little pots, and mix up those three colours and use, mix up the full quantity that you're going to use. And the reason for that is that paint dries, acrylic paint tends to dry darker. And if you keep trying to remix it as you go along, you might not get it to match exactly, because when it's wet, it's going to look lighter than when it dries. So it's quite good to have the full quantity. So there I've got my mixture on the end of my brush. And again, this time I'm using really thick, so neat paint there with hardly any water at all or no water. But again, as with drawing the fine lines, I'm going to take most of the paint off on a bit of kitchen paper. And then I'm tapping the brush up and down on the surface. So that's called stippling. And then when I run out of paint, I can put a bit more on the end of my brush, or I can carry on and get a lighter effect, which is a bit like when we were doing some of our smudging with our rolled up paper, you know, our little tortillions. You can sort of roll the brush around. So here, as it's sort of running out on the end of the brush, I'm getting less paint on the surface and it's a bit lighter. So I'll just add some slightly darker paint there. So again, as we were doing with our masks before, we want to make sure not to try and push the brush under the edge of the paper. So if I remove that now, so you can see you've got quite a crisp edge, like when we were using our masks. Now you could make it completely solid like this, or you could have a sort of broken colour effect, that will be called, where it's patchy. If you think it's too patchy, I'm just going to pick up a little bit of white paint. I've got a white background here, but if you've got the mixture you use for your background, if you want to remove some of it, you can just, or make a more subtle effect, just stipple over the top again. Just let that focus. So it's making a slightly more subtle effect there. You're losing some of the patchiness. So the fine card is really good for getting a crisp edge. However, if you use it over and over again, it will eventually sort of ripple. It might not last as long. So if you were doing some stenciling, this technique, this is the sort of technique that Banksy uses. I don't know if you've heard of Banksy. So he works with stencils, obviously with sort of different kind of paint, different scale, and they might be cut out of plastic rather than card, but it's the same sort of technique. So these will eventually wear out. If you make one with thicker card, it's going to last longer. So if you were doing lots and lots of flowers, you might want to make one, or whatever your shape is, you might want to use thicker card. The only difficulty with using the thicker card is that it's a little bit easier for your brush to go under the edge. So you might not get such a neat edge. So just to show you there, it's sort of slightly, a little bit more speckled. This is neater, but there are two options there. And with, again, you can use your card. just work up to the edge. So where there isn't much paint left on the brush, you see all the little dry bits of paint are flying off the end there. They've dried on the edge of the brush, but that's okay. I can brush those away later. So where I haven't got much paint on the brush, that's making really quite a nice subtle edge fading away here. So you could, again, you can vary it, the amount of paint on the brush, the different tones, and work over. So you might make, you know, a flat shape and then use your pieces of torn card to add some darker or lighter areas. I'm just going to show you, so we have concentrated all the time on black and white, not using any other colors. This is just a little sample that I came across, which I had where this was a project that I actually painted for somebody. So here's the leopard. And in this case, this beige color was the color that was on the wall. So painting on top of it with gray wasn't going to look quite right. It wasn't going to sit very happily on the grey background. So here I've used a mixture of a little bit of black and a bit of brown as well, a bit of colour called burnt sienna. And here you can see, so this was my scale design. So you remember we talked about scale. So here's the tree, and here's a little life-size sample of the tree, and you can see this slightly watercolor effect. If you're painting on the wall, the only thing you have to be careful with the watercolor is that you don't make it so watery that it just runs down the wall. Thank you. And there's a little bit of the fur. Now I just wanted to show you that because I was, can I guess it's a focus? Maybe if I bring it up a little bit closer. I talked quite a lot about painting fur, I noticed over the past workshops. So the fur I've painted with little lines using the rigger brush, and then this, all the tree is painted with a much larger than this sort of pencil brush. And the background of the leopard I cut out. I had a tracing and I cut out the piece of tracing and stuck it to the wall. So it was tracing off a roll, so that I, you know, a large piece of tracing paper, and then traced it on. And then I used a mask at the edge of paper to sort of get a general all over dark beige. So all the techniques that we've been doing. Lastly, I'll put that to one side, sorry. This is the sample that was behind me on the easel over the last few weeks. Now we haven't done any blending really, apart from with the stenciling. And I just wanted to show you a technique which is much more like the smudging that we've done. So here, I hope you can see all of these flowers were painted with lines. So again, it was a larger version of this rigger. And I've got a little bit, I've made sure this is exactly the same color of black that I've been using. So all of this was done with lines. And it looked a bit too sort of sharp and hard. I wanted it to be a bit softer. I've got a white background here. So there are two ways that I can use to blend the colors. One way would be to do minute dots, or, you know, tiny lines very close together. I mean, that's a possibility. I'm blotting them there with my finger. It would take a very long time. The other way is to just get a little bit of dryish paint on the brush and smudge it. So in the same way as with the stenciling, I was rolling the paint off the end of the brush. It's similar here. Now this time with the paint, we don't want it to be, as with the stenciling it was really thick. With the painting the fine lines, it's almost just water. So this is in between. We want it to be, I suppose it would be maybe single cream consistency if I had a pot of it. But I've just mixed a little patch up on the palette. Again, I'm taking quite a bit off the brush before I put it on. The advantage of this kind of filbert brush with a round end is that it'll fit in nicely to a little corner, having that little sort of point. It's too much paint on there. It's going on in too sort of blobby a way. And I'm just almost kind of dusting it on there. So I'm blurring it. So I'm going to put on quite a lot so that it definitely shows up your end. So I'm putting quite a bit on there. Now, this is okay. And if I were painting on the wall, it would be a good idea to then stand back, look at it from a distance, decide whether I need this to be darker, and might move to one of my darker shades or lighter. It looks a little bit too strong for me for this particular painting because I'm imagining I want to see this painting from quite close too. So I'm just going to clean my brush, and I've got the white background. So we're imagining you've either painted your piece of card or your wall or your piece of paper white. But if not, you've got the paint that whatever your background color is. So you've got to get some of your background color on the brush. Just picked up slightly too much water there. It's gone a bit too watery. And then you can just go over what you've done and make it a little bit more subtle while the paint's wet. My hands are always covered in paint. I know some people are very clean painters. I'm not a clean painter. I'm always, by the end of the day, completely covered in paint. But do you see there? I'm just taking it back a bit so that it's a little bit less visible, making that join a little bit more subtle. So it's a sort of scuffing technique, really. A little bit difficult to describe. It's something that you need to have a go at practicing. But there's any questions about that, about the scuffing? If you don't have one of these, if you don't have one of these filbert brushes with the round ends, just an ordinary. This one also has a round end, but we'll ignore that. An ordinary little brush like this, but with the square end would be fine. It's just quite handy if the bristles are fairly long. It just means that you can dab the paint on quite lightly. If it's shorter, it'll still work, but you might have to use the brush a little bit more firmly. So this is, as I said before, I paint a lot of skies, and this is one that I've done in Grisaille. So when I'm painting skies, you see this edge here. So I wanted this edge to look really bright. So what I've done is I've painted the background quite a dark grey to begin with, so that my light looks really light. And here I cut out a piece of card and put that up against the edge of this bright white area to put that in. I've added a little bit more detail afterwards, but that's how I began it, by cutting the shape out and taking away the cloud shape and then using the negative shape on this side, placing it there, and to use as a mask against the grey. And then I've stippled on, as with the stenciling, the white. In here, these softer areas, so this is the grey background showing through, but these softer little highlights, they're done just as I was showing you just now, with a little filbert brush and a little bit of white, scuffing the paint on. And these little wispy clouds here, I've done them also with the sort of scuffing on technique. And so with all of the 3 techniques that we've looked at, using the very watery paint for drawing lines, using the thick paint for the stenciling, and the sort of in-between for scuffing, the main thing two main things to remember. One, mix your colours. First of all, if you're doing something large scale, it's best to have your 3 tones mixed and put them in pots. If you can't do that, just remember that the paint will probably dry darker. So, so once you've chosen whether you're going to use a warm black or a cool black, or beige, you know, whatever you choose to work with, mix your 3 tones. Highlights, you'll probably want to put them on quite thickly. But all of these 3 paint techniques, the lines, the scuffing and the stenciling, the main thing is, remember, you want to take almost all the paint off your brush before you start. And you'll gradually learn how much paint you want to have on the brush. With water-based paints, they dry really fast, so you can always put more on. But if you start out with too much paint on the brush, you will end up with blobs and lumps, and it'll be uncontrollable. Just lastly, if I'll just pop this one here. This is charcoal drawing, and I just wanted to show you that it was actually of a the corner of a very elaborate clock in a museum, but here the background isn't all the same, isn't all one color. So you've got your 3 tones. You might want to think about that, but here I've done it with the charcoal, and you might want to do a charcoal drawing like this, but you could also, you know, with the paint, you could blend out the edge of the paint and not have the one tone going over all of your surface. And this was the one we looked at right at the beginning, I think, another charcoal drawing. In here there are areas of pencil for the very sharp little areas in here, and some of these fine lines, they're done with pencil, and that's and it's mixed with the charcoal. This, I think I said, it took about 10 days to do, and that's me, you know, and I do quite a lot of drawing, so I think, you know, you will absolutely, with these techniques, if you want to make any realistic drawings, you're now all set to go. It's just a matter of carving out the time to do it. You know, not everybody has time. I have the time because it's my job. I think it's a really good idea to practice just using black and white, or, you know, beige and white. Master those techniques of blending in drawing and in painting, and then they just translate into using color. So all of this painting, all of these flowers, it's the same thing. I've used the little rigger where I've wanted to paint a line, or a little pencil brush with a nice point, watery paint, not too much paint on the brush. Where I wanted to do a little blending, so there's a shadow under the tail of the sparrow. You probably can't see it too clearly, but there's a shadow underneath here, so that's using the filbert brush. So I've just painted it and then added the shadows, the same coming down the branch here. You might just be able to see I've done that reflected light line underneath. My branch isn't casting a shadow, but the reflected light and the shadows from the tail, I've tried to create a bit of a summery atmosphere. Yeah. So again, with all of these, the little shadows inside the flowers, it's the same technique. And if I were painting lots of these flowers, I would cut a number of stencils of them, so I'd get all my flowers on. So if I were doing a wall of flowers, I would make 5 or 6 different stencils, and then I would put them all on, and I might turn the stencil round while I'm doing it, so that you get so that they look different. Yeah. And then slightly different shadows, you know, so it doesn't look too repetitive.